Welcome to the Queer and Christian podcast. I'm your host, Brandan Robertson, and I'm thrilled to embark on this journey with you. This podcast is a space where we'll dive deep into the intersection of faith and sexuality, exploring the journeys of queer Christian leaders, artists, and theologians who have courageously reconciled their faith with their queer identity. In each episode, we'll challenge the narratives that have excluded us and reclaim our sacred place within the church. Together, we'll uncover the love and liberation that our faith can truly offer. So whether you're queer, Christian, both, or just curious, this podcast is for you. Join me as we reclaim the Bible, our faith, and our place at the table. Let's listen in to today's conversation. Well, hello, friends, and welcome to episode 2 of the Queer and Christian podcast. I'm so honored that you're joining us once again for another insightful and inspiring conversation about an incredible queer Christian who has worked not only to reconcile their queer identity and their faith, but is now creating beautiful art for queer Christians in the church. If you grew up in church as a queer Christian, you know that we have soft spots for the music that we sang in our church environments. For me, it was the Hillsongs and the Bethels that stirred my spirit as a young closeted queer person and still stir my spirit today, even though both of those communities are notoriously anti-LGBT. And this is a struggle for queer Christians, pastors, and worship leaders alike, because there's not a ton of music that we sing in church that really relates directly to the queer experience. That's where today's guest enters in. Amanda Udis-Kessler is a queer feminist hymnwriter and sacred music composer who has been at work for over a decade, writing queer hymns to be sung in Christian contexts, in Unitarian Universalist contexts, and just in queer contexts in general. This is a fascinating conversation about a woman who has done a lot of work to reconcile her own queer identity with her faith and is now using what she's learned and experienced to create beautiful songs to be sung by queer people and our allies in the church. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Amanda Udis-Kessler. I am so grateful for the chance to finally get to connect with you because I've been aware of your work for some time and we've interacted a little bit, but this is our first full conversation. So thanks for making time to chat with us today.
Thanks for having me on, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, the work that you do in the world is pretty incredible. But before we kind of dive in specifically to your work as somebody who's engaged in queer church music, and I think what's really important is to begin by highlighting the fact that so many queer folks continue to struggle with reconciling their faith and their sexuality. And I know that that is something that you've had experience with. It's something that anyone listening to this podcast is wrestling with. So can we frame this conversation by sharing a little bit about what your journey of coming to terms with your own sexuality, your own queerness, and your faith was like?
So I am a quite unusual person in the realm of Christianity and even in the realm of progressive Christianity because I grew up a secular Jew. I did not start in any religious tradition, and I came to know my bisexuality and queerness long before I had any religious identity. I grew up in New York City, which helps, I think, somewhat. But I knew from my teenage years on that I was on some kind of spiritual or religious journey or both. And probably the first kind of aspect of Christianity that caught my attention was that I music directed a production of Godspell when I was 15 or 16, which was around the time I was starting to come out publicly. And I just found it profoundly moving. I would be sitting at the piano playing All Good Gifts, crying and just going, what's going on here? What is this beauty? And I think for me at the time, it was this notion of there being this community, this welcome, this acceptance, this sense of love and compassion and connection that I didn't have enough of kind of in my day-to-day life at the time. So I probably struggled less accepting my sexuality than a lot of people do. But I wasn't really sure what it was going to mean for me religiously. While my friends, when I was in high school, my friends were all kind of, sneaking out to get drunk or high or whatever. And I was sneaking out to try out religious traditions. And so I would go to, a Baha'i worship or some kind of Christian worship. And at the end, I'd go up to the leader and say, what is your tradition's stance on homosexuality. And this is like the early 1980s. They were all pretty negative. So I would walk out and go, okay, that's not for me. In college, I found my way to the Unitarian Universalists, where I made my home for about 30 years. I actually went to seminary to become a UU minister. That didn't happen, but it was a good time. It gave me a lot of opportunity to think about religious matters. And then in the last 5 to 10 years, I've acknowledged that I needed something more demanding of me and something that had more of a story than UUism did or does. So I have tremendous respect for it. I think it's great. I am truly a universalist. I don't think there is a right religious tradition or only one that's correct. But I do think that for me, kind of choosing to enter into the Jesus story was the right thing to do. I am a fumbling, flailing Jesus follower. I do the best I can, which is usually not very good, but I do have some sense that there is a story, there is an aspiration, there is a hope, there is a dream. And I am invested in trying to live into that and contribute to that being a possibility in the world with my writing, with my music, with my anti-racism work, with the various things I do.
Wow. What an incredible story. And I mean, I think on one hand, it's unique, right? Lots of folks who will find themselves listening to this conversation will have grown up in a conservative Christian environment and had to have done the work of reconciling kind of along the way. But I think you also represent a growing trend that I see among the queer community. And it's not to say that queer people are coming to traditional Christianity in groves, but I do see queer folks having a deep spiritual hunger, and just generationally beyond the queer conversation, people are looking for something more than the amorphous spirituality that has been so helpful to so many over the past 50 years. I do see this kind of return to a rootedness, a return to a story. And so I just find it so fascinating that that's been your journey. Yeah. And the one, you've kind of highlighted this in the story that you've just told, but was there a particular moment? Clearly, you kind of had your coming out experience first and then came into Christianity. But was there a moment where you can recall feeling at home and okay with your queerness? It sounds like growing up in New York and in the Jewish tradition that you did, it wasn't probably a lot of stumbling blocks along the path. But was there a moment where you said, this is who I am and I'm going to own that?
That's a little hard to answer because I was so young when I went through this process. I mean, I was probably clear in my own head by the time I was 12 or 13.
Wow.
And so I think at the time I had a lot of fears about how that would be accepted. And then the one thing that sort of went wrong that I wasn't expecting to go wrong was when I told my parents, they responded worse than I expected them to, not for religious reasons, but just because of whatever their own issues were. But they both had so many kind of lesbian and gay friends. I really was surprised. And so I did go through kind of a tough time. And like so many people out at that age in college, I was kind of an angry activist. But I'm sure there was a moment when I just sort of went, everything's fine, but I couldn't pinpoint it. It wasn't dramatic. There was, however, a moment of my kind of interaction with Christianity when I first had a sense that I should be paying more attention to it as a possibility for me. So I have a sociology doctorate. I did my doctoral research on the LGBT inclusion struggle in the United Methodist Church. And actually, my first book is about that. Fortunately, it's now essentially out of date, which is wonderful because the Methodist Church has gotten more inclusive. Yeah. But I was at their 2000 General Conference. And that year, I was sitting at a huge worship service in the Cleveland Convention Center where the General Conference was. And I was sitting with a liberal pastor who I'd met who'd kind of become my informant from my research. And the way they did communion was they literally passed around lots of little cups and lots of little pieces of bread. I mean, the logistics must have been a nightmare in that big room. But he happened to be sitting on my left, and so he passed me the elements. And I must have looked a little confused. I don't know that I'd ever taken communion before. And he looked at me and he said, "This means God loves you." And that's all he said. And again, I burst into tears, and there was just this moment of peace. and this moment of a sense of beauty and wholeness and wellness. And, a quarter of a century later, I still remember that.
Wow.
So that is the moment I go back to for, not because that's the moment when I thought, oh, this is going to be a path I'm going to follow, but at that moment, kind of everything was fine, which was good because the next week and a half was going to be an absolute nightmare, watching the conservatives say horrifically homophobic things and watching people be harmed. But having that moment toward the beginning of just peace and grace was phenomenal. So,
Wow. Yeah, that is such a beautiful story. And it's at the heart of what Christian inclusion looks like, right? Being welcomed at that table, which is meant not just for some, even though that's what most Christian theology says, but for
yep,
all of us.
yep.
So one of the fascinating things that you've engaged in on your own spiritual journey, and from my understanding, this began in the UU space and now kind of continues in the more distinctly Christian space, is that you're writing music and hymns for spiritual communities, for churches that blend together a message of queerness and inclusion with kind of theology, spirituality. And so many people understand the journey of coming together and reconciling your faith and sexuality. But even in progressive Christian spaces, there aren't that many people that have engaged in the work of actually creating spiritual resources that are rooted in the experience of queerness or that are explicitly inclusive of queerness.
Right.
How in the world did you end up doing this work, and what is that like for you?
Well, okay. So way back in 1999, I ran into a little hymn writing contest for a hymnal supplement called Sing Justice, Do Justice. And it was an economic justice hymnal supplement. And I had been a songwriter already for, 10 years, 15 years. And I thought, well, why not? Why don't I try to write some hymns? I mean, it was absolutely nuts, but I did. I sent them 3 hymns. One of them was the runner-up in the contest, and all 3 were published in the supplement. And
Wow.
so I noticed that and I went, okay, that's really interesting. I continued to write songs. I don't write very good love songs. I write okay, but not great justice songs. And kind of over the years, I just started moving toward writing broadly spiritual songs that weren't necessarily particularly doctrinal. So my second album was kind of heavily UU. My third album was pretty UU, but with a little Christianity in it. And then back in, I want to say maybe 2019, a friend of mine who had been in one of the productions of Godspell I had music directed and who had then gone on to become a UCC pastor, got in touch with me and said, hey, the Hymn Society is putting out a call for hymns for a hymnal called Songs for the Holy Other, song pieces by, about, and for the LGBTQ community. You should write them something. And I found out about this with 2 months to the deadline, and I submitted 25 pieces to them by the deadline. It just unleashed something in me. I will say most of that is not my best writing. I wrote it very fast, and even though the impulses were good and the ideas were okay, it wasn't great work. But they published 2 pieces from it, one of which has gone on to get published all over the place, a piece called Queerly Beloved, which has the kind of usefulness of having fairly straightforward language, being very positive and joyous, and having music that I wrote, but that sounds kind of traditional. So if you're used to singing in mainline Protestantism, you could learn it pretty quickly. So after that happened, I just started writing more and more, and then COVID hit, and I had this insight early on in COVID. Here we were all stuck at home. And, my church, closed up shop and went online. And so by that time I was at a UCC church. And I have a day job that pays pretty well. I'm a college administrator. And so I had this kind of moment of insight. I mean, more traditional language might be kind of a gift of the Spirit when I went, I should write music for churches and make it available for free, put it on a website, share information about the website, scores, recordings, videos, anything, and just say to people, if you had to fire your music director because you don't have any money right now, use my stuff if it works for you. Or, you're online and you need music videos and you've never done that before. Here are videos. So I just got into doing that. I wrote a few things initially that were kind of about COVID, about we can be church even if we're not in the building. But over time, I started to get some commissions. So I found Facebook groups that were really wonderful places to share this stuff. And people started writing to me and saying, will you write something based on this biblical passage? Or will you write something about the gift of the Spirit? Or will you write something about repentance? Or, and then I started writing for the regional conference of the UCC that I'm a part of, the Rocky Mountain Conference. So they have these annual meetings, and I started basically writing new texts for the opening worship. So it just kind of took off, and it was part of my journey and my kind of increased engagement with progressive Christianity, and with trying to understand what it is to try to live into this, to wrestle with biblical passages and try to understand them in context. And because I have an academic background in religion and in sociology, and because I had these decades with the UUs, I was pretty well primed to just kind of shift my focus. So I'd been writing UU music, and I still write some. I mean, I still get the odd UU commission. But now it would be like my pastor would say, well, I want us to talk about Jesus and the Canaanite woman, but in the larger context of our own challenges being welcoming. And I can't find any hymns that take that tack with it. So I would write a new hymn text, and I did actually in that one case. I wrote one called At the Table of the Holy. And long story short, GIA Publications picked it up. They've picked up a few of my things. So that's kind of a long rambling answer, but as I have continued to try to deepen my own spiritual path and struggle with the things I struggle with, that has been a rich kind of resource for ideas for hymns. But also, I'll go to worship and during the sermon, some phrase will get said and I'll be like, I want to turn that into a hymn. So my long time songwriting, I wrote my first song when I was 12. Okay. I'm 58. Wow. That first song was terrible. And I still remember it, and it was terrible. But after decades of doing this, what has happened is I've just taken my songwriting chops and strategies, and I now apply them to writing hymns and worship songs. Usually I write things that I personally need to hear, but sometimes I'll take on an assignment that doesn't necessarily reflect my own theology perfectly, but it's a progressive church, so I'm happy to do what they want. And even in those situations, I learn something from the piece as it unfolds.
Yeah. What an incredible gift. And I feel like we need to get you over to our church to write some hymns for our community too. One of the hymns that I did come across this morning that I listened to a few times, because the title alone is so profound, is The Kingdom of God is the Queerest of Nations. And this hymn really suggests a profound reimagining of what the divine is and how we relate to the divine. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what inspired that particular hymn and kind of what the message is behind it for those who might not have heard it yet.
Sure. And I will say, by the way, that even though I originally wrote music for it, and in Songs of the Holy Other, it appears with its own music, it works really well with traditional music. So if someone likes the text but doesn't like the music, it works really well with traditional tunes. So that was one of the ones that I wrote for that competition, or that hymnal call for pieces. And for a really long time, ever since I started to read the Synoptic Gospels, it was clear to me that Jesus's vision was, at a minimum, let's say, radically different from Rome's vision. So we have to remember Jesus is a Jew. He is an occupied Jew, living in a Roman-occupied society that has previously been occupied by 6 or 7 other empires. I'm forgetting my count exactly, but basically going back hundreds of years. And so his vision, of course, it is a spiritual vision, and he does a lot of spiritual things, but it is not an apolitical vision. It is about living in the world. The word politics, it has gotten so mangled and misused, but really it comes from polis, from city, from living together as communities. And so he has this vision of how we are to transform ourselves to transform the world, how we can love in radical trust, and how we can then engage with whatever's going on around us, take care of people, tend to people, follow the prophetic traditions of, so my favorite Bible verse is Micah 6:8, seek justice, love kindness, live humbly. I've changed the words a little bit, but basically. And
Yeah.
so I think in a way, that's a huge piece of what he's telling us to do. He is encouraging justice, kindness, love, humility. And so it occurred to me that we use the word queer these days descriptively often to mean LGBTQIA people. But in fact, the word has a long history of just meaning different or alternative or other.
Mm.
And I thought, well, this would be sort of an interesting possibility. I'm going to write a hymn text about how queer the kingdom or kingdom of God is, that isn't about sexuality, but that's about all these other things. The last will be first. Children will teach us. Tax collectors and sinners and prostitutes are getting into the kingdom before the pious, and so on. And so I really wanted to kind of lift up that vision and give queer people a way of thinking about queerness that wasn't just about kind of what we do in bed or who we fall in love with, but that also would be singable by people who are inclusive enough to sing the word queer, but who are also potentially open to this much broader vision. And in fact, I'll go even farther and say something a little controversial. I think that vision and dream of Jesus's invites us to change today's society. So I don't think it's merely a question of what our spiritual practices are, what our beliefs are.
Yeah.
It really is about how completely unacceptable it is that we have so much poverty and hunger and homelessness in our day, and that we need to be willing to take risks to be advocates for and be in solidarity with the least among us today. So there were certainly stretches when referring to queer people as an example of the least among us was very fair. And in some parts of the country, it's still very fair.
Yeah.
But for those of us who are white and reasonably well off, however queer we are, sexually or gender-wise, we have an obligation to those people who are darker skinned than us, poorer than us, less secure than us. And so for me, there's a real challenge as well as a real joy.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. And I mean, I kind of want to invite you just a little bit to go deeper into that, because one thing that you've mentioned, I was reading a bit about your own kind of philosophy behind the music that you're writing. And you've mentioned that this music is not just for the oppressed, but it's also intended for people in positions of power who are seeking to live in solidarity with marginalized communities. And this is something that, you hear in progressive Christian circles quite often, that like the fight of liberation is not just for the oppressed, but it actually liberates the oppressors as well. But I also know that, like, I currently pastor a fairly traditional community, and to bring in hymns that would even suggest anything about queerness puts up people's walls for a lot of folks. And I just wonder if you can talk a little bit about the importance of queer music, in particular, music that embraces this philosophy of queerness, and how it might be a tool for those who haven't done the analysis of their own power and privilege and don't see themselves as those who are perpetuating oppression. How the music itself might be a tool to help kind of open their eyes.
So I think that only can happen when that music is used in tandem with inclusive liturgies, which is actually something else I work on and write about, and with sermons that kind of unpack biblical texts that address some of these issues. If we start just with the Bible, so we're not yet talking about Black Lives Matter or wokeness or social justice warriors or anything like that. The Bible itself is quite clear. It is complicated and mixed, but there's a clear strand in it of taking care of those in need. There is a prophetic strand in the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible that's very clear about what you have to do to make sure that the widow, the orphan, and the alien have what they need. In the New Testament, we see these early Christian communities that, according to Acts, actually pool their resources and live with all their stuff in common. I'm just waiting for someone to yell socialist or communist. But also, we see the writing in the letter of James about the importance of works. So the Christian tradition is complex and mixed. It has been used for good. God knows it has been used for plenty of evil. But there are always those strands, those plumb lines in there of loving God and loving your neighbor, loving God by loving your neighbor. Who is my neighbor? Everyone. And while we're at it, we better love our enemies, right? Which is a new topic of great interest for me that I've been thinking about and trying to begin to write about. So the power of queer sacred music, broadly defined, including music for and about LGBTQIA plus people, but also music that just queers the tradition and lifts up these strands of humility and justice and taking care of the poor. This is all really important because, first of all, it is part of what Jesus was about. It's part of what he was doing, undeniably so, according to the Synoptic Gospels. So if we're trying to follow him, we'd really better be trying to understand what that means for us. So you might then say, well, okay, let's have sermons about that. And sure, let's have some liturgy, some opening words about it or a benediction about it. But sacred music is so important because it is where our emotions have the greatest opportunity, in many cases, to blossom in the worship context. Sometimes that's music without words, but when it's powerful music with powerful words, the idea that singing is praying twice, which I think Brian Wren, the hymnwriter, actually wrote a book, I believe, called that, Praying Twice. So we need music that's going to be affirming of all people, that is going to model this profound, inclusive welcome that is so gracious and so inclusive that it goes beyond what you and I can even really imagine. I mean, I'm sure there are people that you and I both feel like, well, we really wish that person wouldn't come to our congregation, whoever that person is. And so we need music and liturgy and sermons and worship and mission work and adult faith formation and children's faith formation that all lift up the radical inclusivity. I mean, and again, it is so radical. It is so welcoming of people, no matter what they do or don't deserve, no matter what they're like, no matter who they love, no matter what their political values, we still don't get that very well. Church is still a very segregated time, racially, politically, in some cases by gender and so on. So we need music and other liturgical materials that will help us engage with and wrestle with this sense of welcome. And when I think of wrestling, I think about the story of Jacob becoming Israel, right? He gets a new name. He also gets a permanent injury. Are we all willing, we especially who have privilege and power in this society, are we willing to be a little bit injured? Are we willing to lose something in order to get that blessing, in order to get that new name? What would that look like? And so for me, even though on a kind of song by song basis, I don't think the majority of my stuff now is LGBTQ specific, but that energy and that sense of the need for inclusion and celebration and delight and yes, humility and repentance, but also profound joy. It really emerges in a way from my queerness. But then it becomes this much bigger phenomenon that all of us can meet in our own ways. So most of us have some kind of privilege and power. Most of us have some kind of disenfranchisement. And so most of us live in these complex spaces. Yeah. Can we bring our complexities to worship and engage with music like this or liturgy like this and both find this profound grace that ought to solicit so much gratitude from us, but also this demand that we be part of the solution in co-creating this beautiful dream.
I love that so much. So, as we kind of come to the end of our conversation, the one thing that I'm really grateful for is in my own life as a queer person, as a queer Christian, I've been so blessed to be able to sit at the feet of people who have been much further along this journey than I have and have gone through and seen the drastic changes that have happened in the past 50 or so years in the church and in society. And I just wonder, you've seen parts of this journey as well unfold in some dramatic ways. And many of the folks that are listening to this, I'm sure, are younger queer Christians. Most of the TikTok audience I try to engage with are like people just beginning these conversations. What would you say to a young Christian person who's just discovering their queerness and is going through all of that fear from what you've seen in the world in your own journey? What wisdom would you have to offer them?
They certainly may face challenges if they were brought up and socialized to feel that you cannot be both queer and Christian. I am blessed to have not been taught that, but I do recognize how many people are. What I would say is we have to hold on to the hope, and it is a mystery, but the hope that whatever our integrity is pleasing to God or the sacred, however we understand that. And that as long as our integrity is not about harming people, I mean, I suppose someone might come along and say, well, my integrity is in stealing things. And I would say, no, it's not. But when we're talking about something like our sexual identity, when we are whole, when we are at peace with ourselves, when we have done whatever work is needed to understand that our sexuality, that our gender identity, and more broadly, that our gender, our race, etc., are not problems to solve, but are part of the beautiful diversity of this creation. Once we have found that peace, and it can be a struggle. We may have to keep coming back to it because the world is going to send us problematic messages that will be harmful and violent. But if we keep our eyes on the prize, if we stay in the race, and if we kind of continue to remember our own goodness and treat everyone we encounter as though they are good as well, not only will we continue to kind of cultivate peace and joy for ourselves, we will be useful for our friends, we will be useful for our family, and we will be useful for the next generation. When I was a young adult, I had no sense that I could or needed to be useful for other people. I mean, you know what they say, teenagers and young adults, it's all about, righteous anger because there's so much injustice out there. And that's not wrong. I mean, I wouldn't argue with that. As I've aged, and I'll say one other thing here, by the way, I am old enough to have been an AIDS activist. I am old enough to have been locked up for civil disobedience with some of the people who founded ACT UP almost 40 years ago. I remember that time, and I remember the despair and rage of that time. And so one thing I would ask young queer Christians to do is learn the history of the gay, then lesbian, gay, then LGBT, then alphabet soup inclusion movement in this country. Learn it even independent of the religious issues. Understand what other people have done, that you can even just be a queer person today and have it be legal to marry and have it, I'm not a big fan of the military, but that it is legal to serve in it is good. Understand the history of that, understand the history of the queer people and allies who have worked to make all religions, but certainly Christianity, especially, inclusive over decades and decades and decades. I mean, I have had the privilege of meeting people who were early activists, in the 70s and 80s. This is a different issue, but I had the privilege of being in the room when the first female Episcopal, I'm going to forget the word now, the first bishop was ordained. So as you age, you begin to see the changes that are taking place, and you play your role in them. So for now, young queer Christian people, attend to your soul and your well-being, make friends, learn, grow, admit when you're wrong, learn that it is possible to have pride as a queer person and still be humble as a Christian. Those things are not in contradiction. In fact, we need them both. We need both of them. And as you grow into these identities, and as you see their complex interweaving, take time to be grateful, take time to care for other people, keep listening, keep learning, keep loving.
Wow. There's so much wisdom in that. And I feel like we need to do a whole nother podcast about pride and humility and the two poles there, because I think there's so much wisdom and beauty in that alone. But thank you so much for sharing your journey. And to those who are listening, I'm going to include all of the links to Amanda's books, to the hymns, to all the good work that you're up to in the world. And yeah, I'm just, again, so blown away and grateful by the journey you've had and your willingness to continue to lean in to help make this world a little bit more just and equal for all people. So, Amanda, thank you so much for taking time to join us today.
Thank you. Have a blessed day.
Well, friends, thank you so much for listening in to today's episode of the Queer and Christian podcast. I hope you found this conversation inspiring and insightful. And if you'd like to learn more about today's guest, go to our show notes where you'll find a biography and a link to all of their incredible work. And if you'd like to learn more about my forthcoming book, Queer and Christian, Reclaiming the Bible, Our Faith, and Our Place at the Table, you can head over to queerchristian.org, where you can pre-order the book and find a ton of other resources to help you on your journey to reconciling your faith and your queer identity. Until next time, thanks for listening.